Well, usually my computer's trying to freeze up before I get started, so. Un momento, por favor. You know what? It's after 9. Might as well. Oh, I really need to finish this opening thing. Huh. And as soon as I get here, I was... Oh, hello. I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Imagine that. Helps if I'm on the right scene. I went for the one without the chat window. Imagine that. Normally I'm standing here, so. Welcome in. It is Thursday night, and we're back into Sherlock Holmes. If you didn't catch last week, it was the first 2 stories of the Return of Sherlock Holmes, which is a collection of Sherlock Holmes stories that was featured in the magazine. Why is my microphone getting static? I didn't sign up for the static microphone. But anyway, if you notice, the red cover book is now gone. Yes, my book is down to 1 now. Okay. But yeah, I'm down to just the 2 copies on Amazon and the Grey Wolf edition, which is available in other online bookstores because of Ingram. So if you want to read me my version of fairy tales and my explanation during the fairy tales, that would be where you get it. But it's, again, Thursday, so it's time for Tales from 221B. And for those of you who may not know why I refer to it that is the 221B Baker Street is the home of Sherlock Holmes. Apparently there's a museum in the actual location now. I kind of want to go there. So if you want to send me to England, by all means. I would spend the entire time making fun of Scotland Yard. As opposed to the mouse, it's 221 and quarter, I think. Anyway. I do want to thank the new followers that I got. Got Nixie. That's always cool. I was a fan of hers. A few other people came in while I was off because, they found my link and say, hey, this guy's kind of hairy. I mean, no, this guy's a wolf, I guess? I don't know. I don't know why people find me. But, let's see, who do I have? I had Strawberry Soju come in. That's cool. Just another wolf dragon. Pretty sure they found me from Twitter. Phoenix, or Nixie. A beautiful alt-goth waifu who does some cosplay occasionally, but she's just cool. If you see me drinking like that, it's because I've got a mixture of coffee and hot cocoa, because it's snowing here. Yes, it does actually snow. I was tempted to put a snowing animation on here, but it would only do it over where my screen is, and it wouldn't cover the entire screen. I don't know how to rig it so it would do that on OBS. But anyway, there's lots of OBS I still need to figure out. Just like my VTube Studio, I can't get it to completely sync with my mouth. I do have a bit of a nasal drip, so if you hear me mute, it's because I'm trying to blow my nose. I don't want to do it in the recording. So, give me a moment real quick and I'll take care of that. But again, we are doing Sherlock Holmes. I raised my sub goal because it wouldn't let me just start it over for some reason. I don't know why. Admittedly, it would be awesome to get, 20 a month, but, I'm not counting on it happening. The only reason I got the massive sub goal was to get my extra emotes was, it was subathon, and my friends like bombing me with gift subs. But since all the gift sub sales are gone now, I'm back to normal. So if you like to sub and want to continue subbing, you can. If Kel will do the rotations like she's supposed to, or if you just check down in the links, I've got other donation tabs and anything else. I also try to sell books because I like to sell books. I have an official site for Grey Wolf, which is on bookshop.org, which I've got books that I've read and books that I want to read and, books that I own listed. And, yeah. Eventually I'm going to try to get a little chat mascot. It's going to be Obsidian. He's a Raven friend. I splurged and bought myself a program to run it for Christmas. Now I just got to figure out how to do it. Because I'm not as technically inclined as I was when I was a young cub. And for those of you not keeping tabs on me on I was about to say Facebook. No one keeps track of me on Facebook. For the people who don't keep track of me on Twitter, my birthday is this month, and I'm going to be 47 in human years. Not really looking forward to it. But let us go ahead and skip over to the study and see what's going on in that room. I'll make sure I hit the right one because I don't need the Christmas special one. I really don't need the Christmas special one because I've decorated that one for Christmas. But anyway, let's go over there. Cool. Again, this is a book that we're reading, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. It is a collection of... I gotta look because I don't really keep track of this kind of thing. I really should. The Return of Sherlock Holmes is 13 stories. We've already read the first 2. Sound alert should be on. I haven't tested them, but you know how that goes. Let me go and check to make sure my level fireplace ambience is going. Okay, it's crackling back there. And looks like my audio is cutting out on me again. Let me go ahead and kill a few windows so I'm not getting as much delay. The video processor on my computer cannot handle me lurking in other people's windows while I'm streaming, clearly. I wish it were a little bit better, but again, I can't afford it. And obviously when my stream freezes, when my browsers freeze, I can't see or hear what's going on with the stream. For that matter, the audio jumps out too. So, of course, my computer isn't liking all the alerts of people going online at the same time as me. So that's just adding to the lag issues. Okay, I can cut off all the things that I do not need. Which unfortunately is most of it. And this is me without using VBridger. Imagine how it'd be if I tried to have everything running at the same time. So we make do with what we have, and we carry on. So if I hesitate to answer something, it's because I'm having to wait for me to hear it on my stream before I can respond. Which is all sorts of just damned annoying, honestly. So, oh, non-essential programs on my computer are being shut off right now. Okay, my computer clock says it is 9:14. So we are already running behind. I'm used to it by now. You guys should be too by now. Hold on, let me do something real quick. Okay. Just make sure that message doesn't go away. But anyway, let's get into our first story for the night, which if you saw my Twitter post, because I refuse to call it an X post, we're trying to do 2 stories tonight, the first one being The Adventure of the Dancing Men, and the second one being The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. Sound good? If we have time, I'll try to do a third one, but I do try to sum up close to 11, just so I can get everything taken care of and set up for transfer, just so that I don't have to wait an extra day. So, let's get into it, shall we? With The Adventure of the Dancing Men. Holmes had been seated some hours in silence, with his long, thin, black curved over a chemical vessel, in which he was brewing a particularly malodorous product. His head was sunk upon his breast, and he looked from my point of view like a strange, lank bird with dull grey plumage and a black topknot. "So, Watson," he said suddenly, "do you not propose to invest in South African securities?" I gave a start of astonishment. Accustomed as I was to Holmes's curious faculties, this sudden intrusion into my most intimate thoughts was utterly inexplicable. "How on earth do you know that?" I asked. He wheeled upon his stool with a streaming test tube in his hand and a gleam of amusement in his deep-set eyes. "Now, Watson, confess yourself utterly taken aback," he said. "I am." "I ought to make you sign a paper to do that effect." "Why?" "Because in 5 minutes you will say that it is so absurdly simple." "I'm sure that I shall say nothing of the kind." "You see, my dear Watson," he dropped his test tube in the rack and began to lecture with an air of a professor addressing his class. "It is really not difficult to construct a series of inferences, each dependent upon its predecessor and each simple in itself. If, after doing so, one simply knocks out all the central circumstances and presents one's audience with a starting point and the conclusion, one may produce a startling, though possibly a matriculous, effect. Now, it was not really difficult, by an inspection of the groove between your left forefinger and thumb, to feel sure that you did not propose to invest in your small capital in the gold fields." "I see no connection." "Very likely not. But I can quickly show you a close connection. Here are the missing links of the very simple chain. 1. You had chalk between your left finger and thumb when you returned from the club last night. 2. You put chalk there when you play billiards to steady the cue. 3. You never play billiards except with Thurston. 4. You told me 4 weeks ago that Thurston had an opinion on some South African property which would expire in the month, and which he desired you to share with him. 5. Your checkbook is locked in my drawer, and you have not asked for the key. 6. You do not propose to invest your money in this manner." "How absurdly simple!" I cried. "Quite so," he said, with a little nettled. "Every problem becomes very childish when once it is explained to you. Here's an unexplained one. See what you can make of this, my friend Watson." He tossed a sheet of paper on the table and turned once more to his chemical analysis. I looked with amazement at the absurd hieroglyphics upon the paper. "Why, Holmes, this is a child's drawing," I cried. "Oh, that's your idea?" "What else should it be?" "That is what Mr. Hilton Cubitt, of Ridingthorpe Manor, Norfolk, is very anxious to know. This little conundrum came by the first post, and he was to follow by the next train. There's a little ring at the bell, Watson. I should be very much surprised if this were he." A heavy step was heard upon the stairs, and an instant later there entered a tall, ruddy, clean-shaven gentleman, whose clear eyes and florid cheeks told me of a life led far from the fogs of Baker Street. He seemed to bring a whiff of his strong, fresh, bracing East Coast air with him as he entered. Having shaken hands with each of us, he was about to sit down when his eye rested upon the paper with the curious markings, which I had just examined and left upon the table. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of these?" he cried. "They told me you were fond of queer mysteries, and I don't think you can find a queerer one than that. I sent the paper ahead so that you might have time to study it before I came." "It is certainly rather a curious production," said Holmes. "At first it would appear to be some childish prank. It consists of a number of absurd little dancing figures across the paper which they have been drawn. Why should you attribute any importance to so grotesque an object? I never should, Mr. Holmes, but my wife does. It is frightening her to death. She says nothing, but I can see the terror in her eyes. That's why I want to sift the matter into the bottom. Holmes held up the paper so that the sun shone upon it full. It was a page torn from a notebook. The markings were done in pencil, and ran in this way. I don't have a picture of it, sorry. Holmes examined it for some time, and then folding the pack carefully back up, he placed it in his pocketbook. This promises to be a most interesting and unusual case, he said. You gave me a few particulars of your letter, Mr. Hilton Cubitt, but I should very much be obliged if you would kindly go over it all again for the benefit of my friend Dr. Watson. I'm not much of a storyteller, said our visitor, nervously clasping and unclasping his great, strong hands. You'll just ask me anything that I don't make clear. I began at the time of my marriage last year. But I want to say, first of all, that though I'm not a rich man, my people have been in Ridlingthorpe for a matter of 5 centuries, and there are no better-known family in the county of Norfolk. Last year I came up to London for the Jubilee, and I stopped at a boarding house in Russell Square, because Parker, the vicar of our parish, was staying in it. There was an American lady there. Patrick was the name. Elise Patrick. In some way we became friends until my month was up, and I was as much in love as a man could be. We were quietly married at a registry office, and when we returned to Norfolk, a married couple. You'll think it very mad, Mr. Holmes, that a man of a good old family should marry a wife in this fashion, knowing nothing of her past or of her people. But if you saw her and knew her, it would help you to understand. She was very straight about it, was Elise. I can't say that she did not give me every chance of getting out of it if I wished to do so. I've had some very disagreeable associations in my life, she said. I wish to forget all about them. I would rather never allude to the past, for it is very painful to me. If you take me, Hilton, you'll make a woman who has nothing that she need be ashamed of. But you will have to be content with my word of it, and to allow me to be silent as all that has passed up to this time when I became yours. If these conditions are too hard, then go back to Norfolk and leave me to my lonely life in which you found me. It was only the day before our wedding that she said those very words to me. I told her that I was content to take her in my own terms, and I have been as good as my word. Well, we've been married now for a year, and very happily we've been. But about a month ago, at the end of June, I saw for the first time signs of trouble. One day when my wife received a letter from America, I saw the American stamp. She turned deadly white, read the letter, and threw it into the fire. She made no allusion to it afterwards, and I made none, for a promise is a promise. But she has never known an easy hour from that moment. There's always a look of fear upon her face, a look as if she were waiting and expecting. She would do better to trust me. She would find that I was her best friend. But until she speaks, I will say nothing. Mind you, she is a truthful woman, Mr. Holmes, and whatever trouble there may be in her past, it's been no fault of hers. I'm only a simple Norfolk squire, but there is not a man in England who ranks his family honor more highly than I do. She knows it well, and she knew it well before she married me. She would never bring any strain upon it, and that I am sure. Well, now I come to the queer part of my story. About a week ago, it was the Tuesday of last week, I found one of the windowsills a number of little absurd dancing figures like the one on the paper. They were scrawled with chalk. I thought it had been a stable boy who had drawn them, but the lad swore he knew nothing about it. Anyhow, they had come there during the night. I had them washed out, and I only mentioned the matter to my wife afterwards. To my surprise, she took it very seriously, and begged me if there were any more came to let her see them. None did come for a week, and then yesterday morning I found this paper lying on the sundial in the garden. I showed it to Elsie, and down she dropped in a dead faint. Since then, she has looked like a woman in a dream, half dazed and with terror always lurking in her eyes. It was then that I wrote and sent the paper to you, Mr. Holmes. It was not a thing that I would have taken to the police, for they would have laughed at me, but you will tell me what to do. I am not a rich man, but if there is any danger threatening my little woman, I would spend my last copper to shield her. He was a fine creature, this man of old English soil, simple, straight, and gentle, with his great, earnest blue eyes and broad, comely face. His love for his wife and his trust in her shone in his features. Holmes had listened to his story, and with the utmost attention, and now he sat for some time in silent thought. "Don't you think, Mr. Cubitt," he said at last, "that your best plan would be to take the mic of a direct appeal to your wife, and to ask her to share her secret with you?" Hilton Hubert shook his massive head. "Promise is a promise, Mr. Holmes. If Elsie wished me to tell me, she would. If not, it is not for me to force her confidence. But I am justified in taking my own line, and I will. Then I will help you with all my heart. In the first place, have you heard of any strangers being seen in your neighborhood?" "No." "I presume that it is a very quiet place. Any fresh face could cause comment?" "In the immediate neighborhood, yes, but we have several small watering places not very far away, and the farmers take in lodgers." "These hieroglyphs have evidently a meaning. If it were a purely arbitrary one, it may be impossible for us to solve it. If, on the other hand, it is systematic, I have no doubt that we shall get to the bottom of it. But this particular sample is so short that I can do nothing. The facts which you have brought me are so indefinite that we have no basis for an investigation. I would suggest that you return to Norfolk, that you keep a keen lookout, and that you take an exact copy of any fresh dancing men that may appear. It is 1,000 pities that we do not have reproduction of those which were first done in chalk on the windowsill. Make a discreet inquiry as to the strangers in the neighborhood. When you have collected some fresh evidence, come to me again. That is the best advice which I can give you, Mr. Hilton Hubert. If there are any pressing fresh developments, I shall be always ready to run down and see you in your Norfolk home." The interview left Sherlock Holmes very thoughtful, and several times in the next few days I saw him take his slip of paper from his notebook, and look long and earnestly at the curious figures inscribed upon it. He made no allusion to the affair, however, until one afternoon, a fortnight or so later, I was going out when he called me back. "You had better stay here, Watson." "Why?" "Because I had a wire from Hilton Cubitt this morning. You remember the Hilton Cubitt of the Dancing Men? He was to reach Liverpool Street at 1:20. He may be here at any moment. I gather from his wire that there has been some new incidents of importance." We had not long to wait, for Norfolk Squire came straight from the station as fast as his hansom could bring him. He was looking worried and depressed, with tired eyes and a lined forehead. "It's getting on my nerves, this business, Mr. Holmes," he said as he sank like a wearied man into an armchair. "It's bad enough to feel that you're surrounded by unseen, unknown folk who have some kind of design upon you, but when in addition to that, you know that it's just killing your wife by inches when it becomes as much as flesh and blood can endure. She's wearing away under it, just wearing away before my eyes." "Has she said anything yet?" No, Mr. Holmes, she's not. And yet there have been times when the poor girl has wanted to speak and yet could not quite bring herself to take the plunge. I have tried to help her, but I dare say I did it clumsily and scared her off from it. She's spoken about my old family and our reputation in the country and our pride and our unsullied honor. And I always felt it was leading to the point, but somehow it turned off before we got there. But you have found out something for yourself? A good deal, Mr. Holmes. I have several fresh dancing men pictures for you to examine. And what is more important, I have seen the fellow. What? The man who draws them? Yes, I saw him at his work, but I will tell you everything in order. When I got back after my visit to you, the very first thing I saw next morning was a fresh crop of dancing men. They'd been drawn in the chalk upon the black wooden door of the tool house, which stands beside the lawn in full view of the front windows. I took an exact copy. Here it is. He unfolded a paper and laid it upon the table. Excellent, said Holmes. Excellent. Pray continue. When I had taken the copy, he rubbed out the marks, but 2 mornings after, a fresh inscription had appeared. I have a copy of it here. Holmes rubbed his hands and chuckled with delight. Our material is rapidly accumulating, he said. 3 days later, a message was left scrawled upon paper and placed under a pebble upon the sundial. Here it is. The characters are, as you see, exactly the same as the last one. But that I determined to lie in wait, so I got out my revolver and I sat up in my study, which overlooks the lawn and the garden. About 2 in the morning, I was seated at the window, all being dark save for the moonlight outside, and I hear footsteps behind me. I was there with my wife in her dressing gown. She implored me to come to bed, and I told her frankly that I wished to see who it was who was playing such absurd tricks upon us. She answered that it was some senseless practical joke, and that I should not take any notice of it. If it really annoys you, Hilton, we might go and travel, you and I, and so avoid this nuisance. What, be driven out of our own house by a practical joker? Said I. Why, we should have had the whole country laughing at us. Well, come to bed, said she, and we will discuss it in the morning. Suddenly as she spoke, I saw her white face grow whiter yet in the moonlight, and her hand tightened upon my shoulder. Something was moving in the shadow of the tool house. I saw a dark, creeping figure which crawled around the corner and squatted in front of the door. Seizing up my pistol, I was rushing out when my wife threw her arms around me and held me with her convulsive strength. I tried to throw her off, but she clung to me most desperately. At last I got clear, but by the time I had opened the door and reached the house, the creature was gone. He had left his trace of his presence, however, for there on the door was the very same arrangement of dancing men which had appeared twice before, and which I have copied on that paper. There was no other sign of the fellow anywhere, though I ran all over the grounds, and yet the amazing thing is that he must have been there all the time, for when I examined the door again in the morning, he had scrawled some more of his pictures under the line which I had already seen. Have you that fresh drawing? Yes, it is very short, but I made a copy of it, and here it is. Again he produced a paper. A new dance was in this form. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, and I could see by his eyes that he was much excited. Was this a mere addition to the first, or did it appear to be entirely separate? It was on a different panel of the door. Excellent. This is far more important for all our purpose. It fills me with hopes. Now, Mr. Hilton Kubert, please continue your most interesting statement. I have nothing more to say, Mr. Holmes, except that I was angry with my wife that night for having held me back when I might have caught the skulking rascal. She said that she feared that I might come to harm. For an instant it had crossed my mind that perhaps what she really feared was that he might come to harm. For I could not doubt that she knew who this man was, and that he meant by these strange signals. But there is a tone in my wife's voice, Mr. Holmes, and a look in her eyes which forbid doubt. And I am sure that was indeed for my own safety that King was in her mind. There's a whole case, and now I want your advice as to what I ought to do. My own inclination is to put half a dozen of my farm lads up in the shrubbery, and when this fellow comes again, to give him such a hiding that he will leave us in peace for the future. I fear it is too deep a case for such simple remedies, said Holmes. How long can you stay in London? I must go back today. I would not leave my wife alone at night for anything. She is very nervous and begged me to come back. I dare say you're right, but if you could have stopped, I might possibly have been able to return with you in a day or two. Meanwhile, you will leave me these papers, and I think it very likely that I shall be able to pay you a visit shortly and to throw some light on your case. Sherlock Holmes preserved his calm professional manner until our visitor had left us, although it was easy for me, who knew him so well, to see that he was profoundly excited. The moment that Hilton Cubitt's broad back had disappeared through the door, my comrade rushed to the table, laid out all the slips of paper containing the dancing men in front of him, and threw himself into an intricate and elaborate calculation. For 2 hours I watched him as he covered sheet after sheet of paper with figures and letters, so completely absorbed in his task that he had evidently forgotten my presence. Sometimes he was making progress and whistled and sang as he worked. Sometimes he was puzzled and would sit for long spells with a furrowed brow and a vacant eye. Finally he sprang from the chair with a cry of satisfaction and walked up and down the room, rubbing his hands together. Then he wrote a long telegram upon cable form. If my answer is to this, I hope, you will have a very pretty case to add to your collection, Watson, he said. I expect that we shall be able to go down to Norfolk tomorrow, and to take our friends some very definite news as to the secret of this annoyance. I confess that I was filled with curiosity, but I was aware that Holmes liked to make his disclosures at his own time and in his own way. So I waited until it should suit him to take me into his confidence. But there was a delay in that answering telegram, and 2 days of impatience followed, during which Holmes picked up his ears at every ring of the bell. On the evening of the 2nd, there came a letter from Hilton Cubitt. All was quiet with him, save for a long inscription which appeared that morning upon the pedestal of the sundial. It enclosed a copy of it. Holmes bent over this grotesque frieze for some minutes, then suddenly sprang to his feet with an exclamation of surprise and dismay. His face was haggard with anxiety. We have let this affair go far enough, he said. Is there a train to Western Walsham tonight? I turned up the timetable. Last had just gone. Then we shall breakfast early and take our very first in the morning, said Holmes. Our presence is most urgently needed. Here is our expected cablegram. One moment, Mrs. Hudson. There may be an answer. No, that is quite what I expected. This message makes it even more essential that we should not lose an hour in letting Hilton Cubitt know how matters stand, for it is a singular and dangerous web in which our simple Norfolk squire is entangled. So, indeed, it proved, as I was to come to the dark conclusion of the story, which had seemed to me to be the only childish and bizarre I had experienced, once again in dismay of horror with which I was filled. Would that I have some brighter ending to communicate to my readers, but these are the chronicles of fact, and I must follow their dark crisis to the strange chain of events, which for some days made Redlingthorpe Manor a household word through the length and breadth of England. We had hardly alighted North Walsham and mentioned the name of our destination when the station master hurried towards us. "I suppose that you are the detectives from London," said he. A look of annoyance passed over Holmes's face. "What makes you think such a thing?" "Because Inspector Martin of Norwich has just passed through, but maybe you are the surgeons. She's not dead, or wasn't by last accounts. You may be in time to save her yet, though it will be for the gallows." Holmes's brow was dark with anxiety. "We are going to Ridlingthorpe Manor," said he, "but we have heard nothing of what has passed there." "It's a terrible business," said the station master. "They are shot, both Mr. Hilton Cubitt and his wife. She shot him, and then herself, so the servants say. He's dead, and her life is despaired of. Dear, dear, one of the oldest families in the county of Norfolk, and one of the most honoured." Without a word, Holmes hurried to a carriage, and during the long 7-mile drive he never opened his mouth. Seldom have I seen him so utterly despondent. He had been uneasy during our journey from town, and I had observed that he had turned over the morning papers with anxious attention. But now suddenly the realization of his worst fears had left him in the blank melancholy. He leaned back in his seat, lost in gloomy speculation. Yet there was much around us to interest us, for we were passing through as singular a countryside as any in England, where a few scattered cottages represented the population of today, while on every hand enormous square town churches bristled up from the flat, green landscape and told of the glory and prosperity of old. At last the violent rim of the German Ocean appeared over the green edge of the Norfolk coast, and the driver pointed with his whip to 2 old brick and timber gables which projected from the grove of trees. "That's Ridlingthorpe Manor," said he. As we drove up to the porticoed front door, I observed the front of it, beside the tennis lawn, a black tool-house and which pedestaled sundial with which we had such strange associations. A dapper little man with a quick, alert manner and a waxed mustache had just descended from a high dog-cart. He introduced himself as Inspector Martin from the Norfolk Constabulary, and he was considerably astonished when we heard the name of our companion. Mr. Holmes, the only crime was only committed 3 this morning. How could you hear about it in London and get to a spot as soon as I?" "I anticipated it. I came in hope of preventing it." "Then you must have important evidence, of which we are ignorant, for they said that they were no more a united couple." "I only have the evidence of the dancing men," said Holmes. "I will explain the matter to you later. Meanwhile, since it is too late to prevent this tragedy, I am very anxious that I should use the knowledge which I possessed in order to ensure that justice be done." Will you associate me with your investigation, or will you prefer that I should act independently? "I should be proud to feel you were acting together, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector earnestly. "In that case, I should be glad to hear the evidence and to examine the premises without an instant unnecessary delay." Inspector Martin had the good sense to allow my friend to do things in his own fashion, and contented himself with carefully noting the results. The local surgeon, an old white-haired man, had just come down from Mrs. Hilton Corbett's room, and he reported that her injuries were serious, but not necessarily fatal. The bullet had passed through the front of her brain, and it would probably come time before she could regain consciousness. On the question of whether she had been shot or had shot herself, he could not venture to express any decided opinion. Certainly the bullet had been discharged at very close quarters. There was only 1 pistol found in the room, and 2 barrels of which had been emptied. Mr. Hilton Cubitt had been shot through the heart. It was equally conceivable that he had shot her than himself, or that she had been the criminal, for the revolver lay upon the floor midway between them. "Has he been moved?" asked Holmes. "We have moved nothing except the lady. We should not leave her lying wounded upon the floor." "How long have you been here, Doctor?" "Since 4 o'clock. "Anyone else?" "Yes, just the constable here." "And you have touched nothing?" "Nothing." "You have acted with great discretion. Who sent for you?" "The housemaid, Saunders." "Was it she who gave the alarm?" "She and Mrs. King, the cook." "Where are they now?" "In the kitchen, I believe." "Then I think we had better hear their story at once." The old hall, oak-paneled and high-windowed, had been turned into a court of investigation. Holmes sat in a great old-fashioned chair, his inexorable eyes gleaming out of his haggard face. I could read in them a set purpose to devote his life to this quest until the client whom he had failed to save should at last be avenged. The trim Inspector Martin, the old grey-headed county doctor, myself, and a stolid village policeman made up the rest of that strange company. The two women told their story clearly enough. They had been aroused from their sleep by the sound of an explosion, which had been followed a minute later by a second one. They slept in adjoining rooms, and Mrs. King had rushed into Saunders. Together they had descended the stairs, the door of the study was open, and the candle was burning upon the table. Their master lay upon his face in the center of the room. He was quite dead. Now, the window, his wife was crouching, her head leaning against the wall. She was horribly wounded, and the side of her face was as red with blood. She breathed heavily, but was incapable of saying anything. The passage, as well as the room, was full of smoke and smell of powder. The window was certainly shut, and fastened upon the inside. Both women were positive upon this point. They had at once sent for the doctor and sent for the constable. Then, with the aid of the groom and the stable boy, they had conveyed the injured mistress to her room. Both she and her husband had occupied the bed. She was clad in her dress. He was in his dressing gown over his nightclothes. Nothing had been moved in the study. So far, they knew there had never been any quarrel between husband and wife. They had always looked upon them as a very amicable couple. These were the plain points of the servants' evidence. In answer to Inspector Martin, they were clear that every door was fastened upon the inside, and that no one could have escaped from the house. In answer to Holmes, they both remembered that they were conscious of the smell of powder from the moment that they ran out of their rooms upon the top floor. "I commend that fact very carefully to your attention," said Holmes to the professional colleague. "And now, I think that we are in position to undertake a thorough examination of the room." The study proved to be a small chamber, lined on 3 sides with books, and with a writing table facing the ordinary windows which looked out upon the garden. Our first attention was given to the body of the unfortunate squire, whose huge frame lay stretched across the floor. His disordered dress showed that he had hastily aroused from sleep. The bullet had been fired at him from the front, and had remained in his body after penetrating the heart. His death had certainly been instantaneous and painless. There was no powder marking upon either his dressing gown or his hands. According to the county surgeon, the lady had stains upon her face, but none upon her hand. "The absence of the latter means nothing, though its presence may mean everything," said Holmes. "Unless the powder from a badly fitting cartridge happens to spurt backwards, one may fire many shots without leaving a sign. I would suggest that Mr. Cubitt's body may now be moved. I suppose, Doctor, you have not recovered the bullet from the wound of the lady." "A serious operation will have to be necessary before that can be done, but there will be 4 cartridges from the revolver. 2 have been fired and 2 wounds inflicted, so each bullet can be accounted for." So it would seem, said Holmes. Perhaps you can account for the bullet which has so obviously struck the edge of the window. He turned suddenly, and his long, thin finger pointed at a hole which had been drilled right through the lower window latch, about an inch above the bottom. "By George," said the inspector, "how did you ever see that?" "Because I looked for it." "Wonderful," said the county doctor. "You're certainly right, sir. Then a third shot has been fired, and therefore a third person must have been present. But who could it have been, and how could they have gotten away?" "That is the problem which we are now about to solve," said Sherlock Holmes. "You remember, Inspector Martin, when the servants said that on leaving their room they were at once conscious of the smell of powder. I remarked that point was an extremely important one." "Yes, sir, but I confess I did not quite follow you." "It suggested that at the time of the firing the window was, as well as the door of the room, had been open. Otherwise the fumes of powder would not have been blown so rapidly through the house. A draught in the room was necessary for that. Both door and window were only open for a short time, however." "How do you prove that?" "Because the candle has not been gutted." "Capital! Capital!" cried the inspector. "Feeling sure that the window had been open at the time of the tragedy, I conceived that there might have been a third person in the affair, who stood outside this opening and fired through it. Any shot directed at this person might hit the sash. I looked, and there, sure enough, was the bullet mark." "But how came the window to be shut and fastened?" "The woman's first instinct would have been shut and fasten the window. But, hola, what's this?" "It was the lady's handbag which stood upon the study table. A trim little handbag of crocodile skin and silver." Holmes opened it and turned the contents out. There were 25-pound notes of the Bank of England, held together by an Indian rubber ink band. Nothing else. "This must be preserved, for it will be figuring in trial," said Holmes. But as he handed the bag and its contents to the inspector, "It is now necessary that we should try to throw some light upon the third bullet, which has clearly, from the splintering of the wood, been fired from inside the room. I should like to see Mrs. King, the cook, again. You said, Mrs. King, that you were awakened by a loud explosion. When you said that, did you mean it seemed to you to be louder than the second one?" "Well, sir, it awakened me from my sleep, so it's hard to judge. But it did seem very loud." "You don't think that there might have been two shots fired almost at the same instant?" "I'm sure I couldn't say, sir." "I believe that it undoubtedly so. I rather think, Inspector Martin, that we have now exhausted all that this room can teach us. If you will kindly step round with me, we shall see what fresh evidence the garden has to offer." A flower bed extended up from the study window, and we all broke into exclamation as we approached it. The flowers were trampled down, and the soft soil was imprinted all over with footmarks. Large masculine feet they were, with particularly long, sharp toes. Holmes hunted about among the grass and leaves like a retriever after a wounded bird. Then, with a cry of satisfaction, he bent forward and picked up a little brazen cylinder. "I thought so," he said. "The revolver had an ejector, and there's the third cartridge. I really think, Inspector Martin, that our case is almost complete." The county inspector's face shone in his intense amazement at the rapid and masterful progress of Holmes's investigation. At first he had shown some disposition to assert his own position, but now he was overcome with admiration and ready to follow without question wherever Holmes led. "Whom do you suspect?" he asked. "I'll go into that later. There are several points in this problem which I have not yet been able to explain as to yet. Now that I have gone so far as I best proceed on my own lines, and then clear the whole matter once and for all. Just as you wish, Mr. Holmes, so long as we get on Anne. I have no desire to make mysteries, but it is impossible at the moment to enter into long and complex explanations. I have the threads of the affair in my hand. Even if this lady should never recover consciousness, we can still reconstruct the events of last night and ensure that justice be done. First of all, I wish to know whether there is any inn in this neighborhood known as Elgridge's. The servants were cross-questioned, but none of them had heard of such a place. The stable boy threw a light upon the matter by remembering that a farmer of that name lived some miles off in the direction of East Ruston. Is it a lonely farm? Very lonely, sir. Perhaps they have not heard yet of what happened here during the night. Maybe not, sir. Holmes thought for a little, and then a curious smile played over his face. Saddle a horse, my lad, he said. I shall wish you to take a note to Elridge's farm. He took from his pocket the various slips of the dancing men. With these in front of him, he worked for some time at a study table. He finally handed a note to the boy with directions to put it into the hands of the person to whom it was addressed, and especially to answer no questions of any sort which might be put to him. I saw that outside the note, addressed like straggling, irregular characters, very unlike Holmes's usual precise hand. It was assigned to Mr. Ab Slaney, Elridge's Farm, East Ruston, Norfolk. I think, Inspector, Holmes remarked, that you would do well to telegraph for an escort, for if my calculations prove to be correct, you may have a particularly dangerous prisoner to convey to the county jail. The boy who takes this note could no doubt forward your telegram. If there is an afternoon train to town, Watson, I think we should do well to take it, as I have a chemical analysis with some interest to finish. This investigation draws rapidly to a close. When the youth had been dispatched with the note, Sherlock Holmes gave his instructions to the servants. If any visitor were to call asking for Mr. Hilton Gibbet, no information should be given as to his condition, but he has been to be shown at once into the drawing-room. He impressed these points upon them with the utmost earnestness. Finally, he led the way to the drawing-room with a remark that the business was now out of our hands, and that we must while away the time as best we might until we could see what was in store for us. The doctor had parted to his patients, and only the inspector and myself remained. I think that I can help you to pass an hour with an interesting and profitable manner, said Holmes, drawing up his chair to the table and spreading out in front of him the various papers upon which were recorded the antics of the drawing men. As to you, my friend Watson, I owe you the very atonement for having allowed your natural curiosity to remain so long unsatisfied. To you, Inspector, the whole incident may appeal to you as a remarkable professional study. I must tell you, first of all, the interesting circumstances connected with these previous consultations with Mr. Hilton Cubitt has had with me in the Baker Street. Then he shortly recapitulated the facts which I have already recorded. I have here in front of me these singular productions, at which one might smile had they not proved themselves to be the forerunners of so terrible a tragedy. I am fairly familiar with all forms of secret writings, and am myself an author of a trifling monograph upon the subject, in which I analyze 160 separate ciphers. Wow. But I confess that this is entirely new to me. The object of those who invented the system has apparently been to conceal that these characters convey a message, and to give the idea that they are mere random sketches of children. Having once recognized, however, that the symbol stood for letters, and having applied the rules which guide us in all forms of secret writings, the solution was easy enough. The first message submitted to me was so short that it was impossible for me to do more than to say with some confidence that the symbol, man standing with his arms up, stood for E. As you're aware, E is the most common letter in the English alphabet, and it predominates to so marked an extent in even a short sentence one could expect to find it most often. Out of 15 symbols in the first message, 4 were the same, so it was reasonable to be set down as E. It is also true that some cases the figure bearing a flag, and in some cases not, but it was probable from the way that which the flags were distributed that they were used to break the sentence up into words. I accepted the hypothesis and noted that E was represented by this symbol. But down came the near difficulty of the inquiry. The order of the English letters after the E is by no means well marked, and any preponderance which may be shown in an average of a printed sheet may be revised in a single short sentence. Speaking roughly, T, A, O, I, N, S, H, R, D, and L are the numerical order in which the letters occur, but T, A, O, and I are nearly abreast of each other, and it would be an endless task to try each combination until the meaning I arrived at. I, therefore, waited for fresh material. In my second interview with Mr. Hilton Cubitt, he was able to give me 2 other short sentences and 1 message, which appeared, since there was no flag, to be a single word. Here are the symbols. Now, in a single word, I've already got 2 E's coming second and fourth in their word of 5 letters. It might be sever, or lever, or never. There can be no question that the latter, as a reply and appeal, is far the most probable, and the circumstances pointed to it being the reply written by the lady. Accepting it as correct, we are now able to say that the symbols stand respectively as N, V, and R. Even now I am in considerable difficulty, but a happy thought put me in the possession of several other letters. It occurred to me that these appeals came, as I expected, from someone who had been intimate with the lady in their earlier life, a combination which contained 2 E's, with 3 letters between them. That might stand for Elsie. On examination I found that such a combination formed the termination of the message, which was 3 times repeated. It was certain to appeal to Elsie, and the way I had got to the 2 I, L, S, and I. But what could appeal it? There were only 4 letters in the word which preceded Elsie, and it ended in E. Surely the word must be come. I tried all 4 letters ending in E, and could find none that fit the case. So now I was in possession of C, O, and M, and I was in a position to attack the first message at once, dividing it into words and putting dots for each symbol, which is now still unknown. So treated it, I worked it out in this fashion. M, E, R, E, E, L, S, L, N, E. Now, the first letter of can only be an A, which is the most useful discovery, since it occurs in no fewer than 3 times in a short sentence, and the H is also apparent in the second word. Now it comes. Am here, A, E, slain. Or, filling in the obvious vacancies for the name, I am here, Abe Slaney. I had so many letters now that I could proceed with a considerable confidence to the second message, which worked out to be in this fashion: A, E-L-R-I-E-S. Here I could only make sense of it putting a T or G for the missing letters, and supposing that the name was that of some house or into at which the writer was staying. Inspector Martin and I had listened for the utmost interest to the full and clear account of how my friend had produced results which had led to the complete command over our difficulties. "What did you do then, sir?" asked the inspector. I have every reason to suppose that Abe Clancy was an American, and since Abe is an American contraction, and since a letter from American had been the starting point of the troubles, I had also every cause to think that there was some criminal secret in the matter. The lady's allusions to her past and her refusal to take her husband into her confidence both pointed in that direction. I therefore cabled to my friend Wilson Hargrave of the New York Police Bureau, who has been more than once of my use of knowledge of London crime. I asked him whether the name Abe Slaney was known to him. Here is his reply. The most dangerous crook in Chicago. On the very evening upon which I had his answer, Hilton Cubitt sent me a last message from Slaney. Working from the known letters, took this as... Elsie, R-E-R to meet thy go. An addition of the P and D duplicated the message which showed me that the rascal was proceeding with persuasion to threats, and my knowledge of the crooks of Chicago prepared me to find that he might very rapidly put his words into action. I at once came to Norfolk with my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, but unhappily only in time to find that the worst had already occurred. It is a privilege to be associated with this case. With you and the handling of the case, said the inspector warmly. You will excuse me, however, if I speak frankly to you. You are only answerable to yourself, but I have to answer to superiors. If this Abe Slaney living at Elridge's is indeed a murderer, and if he has made his escape while I'm seated here, I should certainly get into serious trouble. You need not be uneasy. He will not try to escape. How do you know? To fly would be a confession of guilt. Then let us go and arrest him. I expect him here very instant. But why should he come here? Because I've written him and asked him. But this is incredible, Mr. Holmes. Why should he come because you have asked him? Why should not such a request rather rouse his suspicion and cause him to fly? I think I have known how to frame the letter, said Sherlock Holmes. In fact, if I am not very much mistaken, here is the gentleman himself coming up the drive. A man was striding up the path which led to the door. He was a tall, handsome, swarthy fellow, clad in a suit of grey flannel, with a Panama hat, a bristling black beard, and a great aggressive hooked nose, and flourishing a cane as he walked. He swaggered up the path as if the place belonged to him, and we heard his loud, confident peal at the bell. I think, gentlemen, said Holmes quietly, that we had best take up our position behind the door. Every precaution is necessary when dealing with such a fellow. You will need your handcuffs, Inspector. You can leave the talking to me. We waited in silence for a moment, one of those minutes which one could never forget. Then the door opened and the man stepped in. In an instant, Holmes clapped a pistol to his head and Martin slapped the handcuffs round his wrists. It was all done so swiftly and deftly that the fellow was helpless before he knew what had struck. He glared from one to the other with his pair of black blazing eyes. Then he burst into a bitter laugh. "Oh, gentlemen, you have the drop on me this time. I seem to have been knocked up against something hard. But I came here in answer to a letter from Mrs. Hilton Chubett. Don't tell me that she is in on this. Don't tell me that she helped you set a trap for me. Mrs. Hilton Cubitt is seriously injured and is at death's door. The man gave a hoarse cry of grief which rang through in the house. You're crazy, he cried furiously. It was he that was hurt, not she. Who would have hurt little Elsie? I may have threatened her, God forgive me, but I would not have touched a hair of that pretty head. Take it back, you. Say that she is not hurt. She was found badly wounded by the side of her dead husband. He sank with a deep groan to the settee and buried his face in his manacled hands. For 5 minutes he was silent. Then he raised his face once more and spoke with the cold composure of despair. I have nothing to hide from you, gentlemen, said he. If I shot the man, he had his shot at me, but there's no murder in that. But if you think I could have hurt the woman, then you don't know either me or her. I tell you, there was never a man in the world who loved a woman more than I loved her. I had a right to her. She was pledged to me years ago. Who is this Englishman that he should come between us? I tell you that I had first right to her, and that I was only claiming my own. She broke away from your influence when she found the man you are, said Holmes sternly. She fled from America to avoid you, and she married an honorable gentleman in England. You dogged her and followed her and made her life a misery in order to induce her to abandon the husband whom she loved and respected, in order to fly with you, whom she feared and hated. You have ended by bringing about the death of a nobleman and driving his wife to suicide. That is your record in this business, Mr. Abe Slaney, and you will answer for it to the law. If Elsie dies, I care nothing about what becomes of me, said the American. He opened one of his hands and looked at the note crumpled in his palm. See here, mister, he cried with a gleam of suspicion in his eyes. You're not trying to scare me over this, are you? If the lady is hurt as bad as you say, who was it that wrote this note? He tossed it forwards to the table. I wrote it to bring you here. You wrote it? There is no one on earth outside the joint who knew the secret of our dancing men. How came you to narrate it? What one man can invent, another can discover, said Holmes. There's a cab coming to convey you to Norwich, Mrs. Slaney, but meanwhile you have come to make some small reparation for the injury you have wrought. Are you aware that Mrs. Hilton Cubitt has herself lain under grave suspicion of murder for her husband, and that it was only my presence here and the knowledge which I happened to possess which had saved her from the accusation? The least you owe her is to make it clear to the whole world that she was in no way, directly or indirectly, responsible for his tragic end. That's nothing better, said the American. I guess the very best cause I can make for myself is the absolute naked truth. It is my duty to warn you that it will be used against you, cried the inspector, which was magnificent fair play by the British criminal law. Slaney shrugged his shoulders. I'll chance that, he said. First of all, I want you gentlemen to understand that I have known the lady since she was a child. There were 7 of us in the gang in Chicago, and Elsie's father was the boss of the joint. He was a clever man, was old Patrick. It was he who invented the writing, which would pass as a child's scrawl unless you happened to have the key to it. Well, Elsie learned some of our ways, but she couldn't stand the business, and she had a bit of honest money of her, so she gave us all the slip and got away to London. She had been engaged to me, and she would have married me, I believe, if I had taken another profession. But she would have nothing to do with anything on the cross. It was only after her marriage to this Englishman that I was able to find out where she was. I wrote to her and got no answer. After that I came over, and as the letters were no use, I put the messages where she could read them. Well, I've been here a month now. I've lived in that farm where I had room down below, and could get in and out every night, no one the wiser. I tried all I could to coax Elsie away. I knew that she would read the messages, for once she wrote an answer under one of them. Then my temper got the better of me, and I began to threaten her. She sent me a letter then, imploring me to go away, and saying that it would break her heart if any scandal should come to her husband. She said that she would come down when her husband was asleep and at 3 in the morning and speak with me through the end window, if I should go away afterwards and leave her in peace. She came down and brought money with her, trying to bribe me to go. This made me mad, and I caught her arm and tried to pull her through the window. At that moment, in rushed the husband with his revolver in his hand. Elsie had sunk upon the floor, and we were face to face. I was healed also, but I held up my gun to scare him off and let me get away. He fired and missed me. I almost pulled off almost the same instant as he dropped down. I made my way across the garden, and as I went I heard the window shut behind me. That's the God's truth, gentlemen, every word of it, and I heard no more about it until that lad came riding up with a note which made me walk in here, like a jay, and give myself into your hands. A cab had driven up whilst the American had been talking. 2 uniformed policemen sat inside. Inspector Martin rose and touched his prisoner on the shoulder. It is time for us to go. Can I see her first? No, she is not conscious. Mr. Holmes, I only hope that if I ever see you again, in its important case, that I shall have the good fortune to have you by my side. We stood at the window and watched the cab drive away. As I turned back, my eye caught the pellet of paper which the prisoner had tossed upon the table. It was a note which Holmes had decoyed him. You can see if you can read it, Watson, said he, with a smile. It contained no word but the little line of dancing men. If you use the code which I have explained, said Holmes, you'll find that it simply means, come here at once. I was convinced that it would be an invitation which he would not refuse, since he could never imagine that it would come from anyone but the lady. And so, my dear Dr. Watson, we have ended by turning the dancing men to good, when they have so often been used as agents of evil. And I think that I have fulfilled my promise of giving you something unusual for your notebook. 3:40 is our train, and I fancy we should be back at Baker Street in time for dinner. Only one word of epilogue. The American, Abe Slaney, was condemned to death at the winter assizes in Norwich, but his penalty was changed to penal servitude in consideration of mitigating circumstances and the certainty that Hilton Cubert had fired the first shot. Of Mrs. Hilton Cubert, I only know that I have heard that she recovered entirely, and that she still remains a widow, devoting her whole life to the care of the poor and to the administration of her husband's estate. Whew. So many voices in that one. So, what did you think? Yeah, it's more coffee. Man, that story took longer than I thought it would. Let's see, how long is the next one? There's a mystery first, but first, coffee. See, that one was 16 pages. Yeah, that long for that. I just wish I could have shown the pictures. Because the book and the magazine have the dancing men drawn into it. I guess if I had had enough forethought, I would have found a way to do it. But I didn't think about it. So how's your day been, Squall? Apparently, my friend's playing... What game are they playing? Oh, they've already finished. Okay. Yep. Having to go back to work. It happens. At least if you have a job. I don't, so I do this. Let's see. What's the next story? Next story is not as long, so might finish a little after. Well, I know I'll finish after 11. This is the next one I haven't read before, and I don't remember ever reading The Solitary Cyclist. But it's only 13 pages, so I might as well get to it, I suppose. Definitely gotta hydrate, even if I'm drinking coffee. Do eat. Okay. See, this one is from January of 1904. Dang. So, 119 years ago. I like old stories. And they still stand up, so. Language has changed a little, but that's a given. Okay, Super Animal, where my friends are playing. So let us begin. The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. From the years of 1894 to 1901, inclusive, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was a very busy man. It is safe to say that there was no public case of any difficulty in which he was not consulted during those 8 years, and there were hundreds of private cases, some of them of the most intricate and extraordinary character, in which he played a prominent part. Many startling successes and a few unavoidable failures were the outcome of this long period of continuous work. As I have preserved very full notes of all these cases, and was myself personally engaged in many of them, it may be imagined that it is no easy task to know which I should select to lay before the public. I shall, however, persevere my former rule, and give the preference to those cases which derive their interest not so much from the brutality of the crime as from the ingenuity and dramatic quality of the solution. For this reason, I will now lay before the reader facts connected with Miss Violet Smith, the solitary cyclist of Charlington, and the curious sequel of our investigation, which culminated in unexpected tragedy. It is true that the circumstances did not admit any striking illustration of those powers for my friend is famous, but there were some points about the case which made it stand out in those long records of crime from which I gather my material for these little narratives. On referring to my notebook for the year 1895, I find that it was upon Saturday, the 23rd of April, when we first heard of Miss Violet Smith. Her visit was, I remember, extremely unwelcome to Holmes, for he was immersed at the moment in a very abstruse and complicated problem concerning the particular persecution to which John Vincent Hardin, a well-known tobacco millionaire, had been subjected. My friend, who loved above all things the precision and concentration of thought, resented anything which distracted his attention from the matter in hand, and yet without a harshness which he was foreign to his nature. It was impossible to refuse to listen to the story of the young and beautiful woman, tall, graceful, and queenly, who presented herself at Baker Street late in the evening and implored his assistance and advice. It was vain to urge that his time was already fully occupied, for the young lady had come with a determination to tell her story, and it was evident that nothing short of force could get her out of the room until she had done so. With a resigned air and a somewhat weary smile, Holmes begged the beautiful intruder to take a seat and inform us what it was that was troubling her.
At least it cannot be your health.
Oh, at least it cannot be your health, said he, as his keen eyes darted over her. So ardent a cyclist must be full of energy. She glanced down in surprise at her own feet, and I observed the slight roughening in the side of the sole caused by the friction of the edge of the pedal.
Yes, I bicycle a good deal, Mr. Holmes, and that has something to do with my visit to you today.
My friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it as close with attention and as little sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. You'll excuse me, I'm sure. It was my business. As he said as he dropped it, I nearly fell into an error of supposing that you were typewriting. Of course, it is obvious that it is music. You observe the spatulate's finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions. There is a spirituality about the face, however. He gently turned towards the light, which the typewriter does not generate. This lady is a musician.
Yes, Mr. Holmes, I teach music.
In the country, I presume, from your complexion.
Yes, sir, near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey.
A beautiful neighborhood, and full of the most interesting associations. You remember, Watson, that it was near there that we took Archie Stamford, the forger. Now, Miss Violet, what has happened to you near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey? The young lady, with great clearness and composure, made the following curious statement.
My father is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was James Smith, who conducted the orchestra of the Old Imperial Theatre. My mother and I were left without a relation in the world except for one uncle, Ralph Smith, who went to Africa 25 years ago, and we never heard a word from him since. When father died, we were left very poor, but one day we were told that there was an advertisement in the Times inquiring for our whereabouts. You can imagine how excited we were, for we thought that someone had left us our fortune. We went at once to the lawyer whose name was given in the paper. There we met two gentlemen, Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley, who were home on a visit from South Africa. They said that my uncle was a friend of theirs and had died some months before the great poverty in Johannesburg, and that he had asked them both with his last breath to hunt up his relations and see that they were in no want. It seems strange to us that Uncle Ralph, who took no notice of us when he was alive, should be so careful to look after us when he was dead. But Mr. Carruthers explained that the reason was that my uncle had just heard of the death and of his brother and felt so responsible for our fate.
"Excuse me," said Holmes. "When was this interview?"
"Last December, 4 months ago."
Proceed.
Mr. Woodley seemed to me the most odious person, for he was ever making eyes at me, the coarse, puffy-faced, red-moustached young man, and his hair plastered down on each side of his forehead. I thought that he was perfectly hateful, and that I was sure that Cyril would not wish me to know such a person.
"Oh, Cyril was his name," said Holmes, smiling. The young lady blushed and laughed.
"Yes, Mr. Holmes, Cyril Morton, an electrical engineer, and we hope to be married at the end of the summer. Dear me, how did I get talking about him? What I wished to say was that Mr. Woodley was perfectly odious, and that Mr. Carruthers, who was a much older man, was mere agreeable. He was a dark, sallow, clean-shaven, silent person, but he had polite manners and a pleasant smile. He inquired how we were left, and on finding that we were very poor, he suggested that I should come and teach music to his only daughter, aged 10. I said that I did not like to leave my mother, on which he suggested that I should go home to her every weekend, and he offered me 100 a year, which was certainly splendid pay. So it ended by my accepting, and I went down to Chiltern Grange, about 6 miles from Farnham. Mr. Carruthers was a widower, but he engaged a lady housekeeper, a very respectable elderly person, named Mrs. Dixon, who took after his establishment. The child was a dear, and everything promised well. Mr. Carruthers was very kind and very musical, and we had most pleasant evenings together. Every weekend I went home to my mother in town. The first flaw in my happiness was at the arrival of the red-moustached Mr. Woodley. He came for a visit of a week, and, it seemed like 3 months to me. He was a dreadful person, a bully to everyone else, but he had something fiercely worse. He made odious love to me, boasted of his wealth, and that if I married him I would have the finest diamonds in London, and finally, when I should have nothing to do with him, he seized me by the arms one day, and after dinner he was hideously strong, and he swore that he would not let me go until I'd kissed him. Mr. Carruthers came in and tore him off of me, on which he turned upon his own host, knocking him down and cutting on his face. That was the end of his visit, as you can imagine. Mr. Carruthers apologized to me the next day, and assured me that I should never be exposed to such an insult again. I have not seen Mr. Woodley since. And now, Mr. Holmes, I come at last to the special thing which has caused me to ask for your advice today. You must know that every Saturday afternoon I ride on my bicycle to Farningham Station in order to get there by the 12:21 or 12:22 to town. The road from Chiltern Grange is a lonely one, and at a spot it is particularly so, for it lies over a mile between Charlingham Heath upon one side and the woods which lie around Charlington Hall upon the other. You could not find a more lonely tract of road anywhere, and it was quite rare to meet so much as a cart, a peasant, or until you reached the high road of Crockberry Hill. 2 weeks ago, as I was passing this place, I chanced to look back over my shoulder, and about 200 yards behind me, I saw a man who was also on a bicycle. He seemed to be a middle-aged man with a short, dark beard, I looked back before I reached Farnham, but the man was gone, so I thought no more about it. But you can imagine how surprised I was, Mr. Holmes, when on my return on Monday I saw the same man on the road, on the same stretch. My astonishment was increased when the incident occurred again, exactly as before on the following Saturday and Monday. He always kept his distance, but did not molest me in any way, but still, it was certainly very odd. I mentioned it to Mr. Carruthers, who seemed interested in what I had to say, and told me that he had ordered a horse and a trap so that in the future I should not have to pass over these lonely roads without some companion. The horse and trap were to come this week, but for some reason they were not delivered, and again I had to cycle to the station. That was this morning. You can think that I looked out when I came to Charlington Heath, and there, sure enough, was the man, exactly as been the 2 weeks before. He always kept so far from me that I could not clearly see his face, but I know it certainly was someone whom I did not know. He was dressed in a dark suit with a cloth cap. The only thing about his face I could clearly see was his dark beard. Today, I was not alarmed, but I was filled with curiosity, and I determined to find out who he was and what he wanted. I slowed down my machine, but he slowed down his. Then I stopped altogether, but he stopped also. Then I laid a trap for him. With a sharp turning in the road that I pedaled very quickly around this, then I stopped and waited. I expected him to shoot around and pass me before he could stop, but he never appeared. Then I went back to look around the corner. I could see a mile of road, but he was not on it. To make it more extraordinary, there was no side road at this point down which he could have gone.
Holmes chuckled and rubbed his hands. "This case certainly presents some features of its own," said he. "How much time elapsed between your turning the corner and your discovery that the road was clear?"
2 or 3 minutes.
Then he could not have retreated down the road, and you say that there are no side roads.
None.
Then he certainly took a footpath on one side or the other.
It could have not been on either side of the heath, or I should have seen him.
So by the process of exclusion, we arrived to the fact that he made his way towards Charlton Hall, which, as I understand, is situated on its own grounds on one side of the road. Anything else?
Nothing, Mr. Holmes, save that I was perplexed that I felt I should not be happy until I had seen you and had your advice.
Holmes sat in silence for a little time. "Where is the gentleman to whom you are engaged?" he asked at last.
He is in Midland Electrical Company, at Coventry.
He would not pay you a surprise visit.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, as if I should not have known him.
Have you any other admirers?
Several, before I knew Cyril.
And since?
There was only this dreadful man Woodley, if you can call him an admirer.
No one else? Our fair client seemed a little confused. Who was he? Asked Holmes.
Oh, it may be a mere fancy of mine, but it has seemed to me that my employer, Mr. Carruthers, takes a great deal of interest in me. We are thrown rather together. I play his accompaniments in the evening. He has never said anything, and he is a perfect gentleman, but a girl always knows.
Ha! Holmes looked grave. What does he do for a living?
He is a rich man.
No carriages or horses?
Well, at least he is fairly well-to-do, but he goes into the city 2 or 3 times a week. He is deeply interested in the South African gold shares.
You will let me know if any fresh developments, Mrs. Smith, or Miss Smith. I'm very busy just now, and I will find some time to make some inquiries into your case. In the meantime, take no step without letting me know. Goodbye, and I trust that we shall have nothing but good news from you. Is it part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers? Said Holmes as he pulled the meditative pipe. But for choice not on bicycles and lonely country roads. Some secretive lover, beyond all doubt. But there are curious and suggestive details about the case, Watson. That he should appear only at that point. Exactly. The first effort must be made to find out who the tenants of Charlington are. And then again, how about the connection between Carruthers and Woodley, since they appear to be men of such a different type? How they came both to be looked upon in Ralph Smith's relations. One more point. What sort of menagerie is it that pays double the market price for a governess, but does not keep a horse, although 6 miles from the station? Odd, Watson. Very odd. You will go down, then? Now, my fellow, you will go down. This may be some trifling intrigue, and I cannot break from my other important research for the sake of it. On Monday you will arrive early at Farnham. You will conceal yourself at Charlington Heath, and you will observe these facts for yourself, and act as your own judgment advises. Then, having inquired as to the occupants of the hall, you will come back to me and report. And now, Watson, not another word of the matter until we have both solid stepping stones on which we may hope to get across to our solution. We had ascertained from the lady that she went down on the Monday by the train which leaves Waterloo at 9:50, so I started early and caught the 9:13. At Farnham Station I had no difficulty in being directed to Charlington Heath. It was impossible to mistake the scene of the young lady's adventure, for the road runs between the open heath on one side and an old yew hedge upon the other, surrounding a park which is studded with magnificent trees. There was a main gateway of lichen-studded stone, each side of a pillar surmounted a moulding of Hildreth's emblems. But besides this central carriage drive, I observed several points where there were gaps in the hedge, and paths leading through them. The house was invisible from the road, and the surroundings all spoke of gloom and decay. The heath was covered in golden patches of flowering gorse, gleaming magnificently in the light of the bright spring sunshine. Behind one of these clumps I took my position, so as to command both the gateway of the hall and the long stretch of road upon either side. It had been deserted when I left it, but now I saw a cyclist riding down the opposite direction in that which I had come. He was clad in a dark suit, and I saw that he had a black beard. On reaching the end of the Charlington grounds, he sprang up from his machine and led it through a gap in the hedge, disappearing from my view. A quarter of an hour passed, and then a second cyclist appeared. This time it was a young lady coming from the station. I saw her look about her as she came to Charlington Hedge. An instant later, the man emerged from the hiding place and sprang upon his cycle and followed her. On all the broad landscape there were only these two moving figures, the graceful girl sitting very straight upon a machine, and the man behind her bending low over his handlebars, with a curiously furtive suggestion in every movement. She looked back at him and slowed her pace. He slowed also. She stopped, and he stopped at once too, keeping 200 yards between them. Her next movement was unexpected as she sprinted. She suddenly whisked her wheels around and dashed straight at him. He was as quick as she, however, and darted out in a desperate flight. Presently she came back up the road again, her head haughtily in the air, not deigning to take further notice of her silent attendant. He had turned also, and still kept his distance until the curve of the road had hid them from my sight. I remained in my hiding place, and it was well that I did so, for presently the man repaired his cycling slowly back. He turned in at the hall gates and dismounted from his machine. For few minutes I could see him standing among the trees. His hands were raised, and he seemed to be settling his necktie. Then he mounted a cycle and rode away from me down the drive towards the hall. I ran across the heath and peered through the trees. Far away I could catch glimpses of the old grey building with its bristling Tudor chimneys, but the drive ran through a dense shrubbery, and I saw no more of my man. However, it seemed to me that I had done a fairly good morning's work, and I walked back in high spirits to Farnham. The local house agent could tell me nothing of Charlington Hall, and referred me to a well-known firm of Pall Mall. There I halted on my way home, and met with the courtesy of my representative. No, I could not have Charlington Hall for the summer. I was just too late. It had been let out a month ago. Mr. Williamson was the name of the tenant. He was a respectable elderly gentleman. The polite agent was afraid he could say no more, as the affairs of his client were not matters that he could openly discuss. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention to my long report, which I was able to present him that evening, but it did not elicit that word of curt praise which I had hoped for, and should have valued. On the contrary, his austere face was even more severe than usual as he commented upon his things that I had done and the things I had not. Your hiding place, my dear Watson, was very faulty. You should have been behind the hedge. Then you would have had a close view of the interesting person. As it is, you were some 100 yards away, and thinks she does not know the man. I am convinced she does. Why otherwise should he be so desperately anxious that she should not get so near him as to see his features? You describe him as bending over the handlebar. Concealment again, you see. You really have done remarkably badly. He returns to the house, and you want to find out who he is. You come to a London house agent. What should I have done, then? I cried with some heat. Gone to the nearest public house. That is the centre of country gossip. They would have told you every name, from the master to the scullery maid. Williamson. It conveys nothing to my mind. If he is an elderly man, he is not an active cyclist who spirits away from an athletic young lady's pursuit. What have we gained from your expedition? The knowledge that the girl's story is true, I never doubted. That there is a connection between the cyclist and the Hall, I never doubted that either. That the Hall is tenanted by Williamson, who's the better for that? Well, well, my dear sir, don't look so depressed. We can do a little more until Saturday evening. And in the meantime, I may make one or two inquiries myself. Next morning we had a note from Miss Smith, recounting shortly and accurately the very incidents which I had seen, but the path of the letter lay in the postscript.
I am sure that you will respect my confidence, Mr. Holmes, when I tell you that my place here has nothing difficult owing to the fact that my employer has proposed marriage to me. I am convinced that his feelings are most deep and most honorable. At the same time, my promise is, of course, given. He took my refusal very seriously, but also very gently. You can understand, however, that the situation is a little strained.
Our young friend seems to be getting into deep waters, said Holmes thoughtfully as he finished the letter. This case certainly presents more features of interest and more possibility of development than I had originally thought. I should be none the worse for a quiet, peaceful day in the country, and I am inclined to run down this afternoon and test one or two theories which I have formed. Holmes's quiet day in the country had a singular termination, for he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discolored lump upon his forehead, besides a general air of dissipation which would have made his own person the fitting object of Scotland Yard investigation. He was immensely tickled by his own adventures, and laughed heartily as he recounted them. I get so little active exercise that it is always a treat, said he. You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. Occasionally it is of service. Today, for example, I should have come out very ignominiously grief without it. I begged him to tell me what had happened. I found that country pub which I had already recommended to your notice, and there I made my discreet inquiries. I was in the bar and had a gregarious landlord and was giving me all that I wanted. Williamson is a white-bearded man, and he lives alone with a small staff of servants at the hall. There is a rumor that he is or has been a clergyman, but one or two incidents of his short residence at the hall struck me as particularly unecclesiastical. I've already made some inquiries as a clerical agency, and they tell me that there was a man of that name in orders whose career had been a singularly dark one. The landlord further informed me that there are usually weekend visitors. A warm lot, sir, at the hall, and especially one gentleman with a red mustache, Mr. Woodley by name, who was always there. We got as far as this man when whom should walk in but the gentleman himself, who had been drinking his beer in a tap-room, and we heard the whole conversation. Who was I? What did I want? What did I mean by asking questions? He had a fine flow of language, and his adjectives were very vigorous. He ended his string of abuse with a vicious backhander, which I failed to extremely avoid. The next few minutes were delicious. It was a straight left against a ruffian slugging. I emerged as you see me. Mr. Woodley went home in a cart. So ended my country trip, and it must be confessed that, however enjoyable, my day on the Surrey border has not been much more profitable than your own. Thursday brought another letter from our client.
You will not be surprised, Mr. Holmes,
Said she,
that I hear I am leaving Mr. Carruthers' employment. Even the high pay cannot reconcile me to the discomfort of my situation. On Saturday I come up to town, and I do not intend to return. Mr. Carruthers has got the trap, and so the dangers of my lonely road, if there ever were any dangers, are now over. As to the special cause of my leaving, it is not merely the strange situation with Mr. Carruthers, but it is the appearance of that odious man, Mr. Woodley. He was always hideous, but he looks more awful than ever now, for he appears to have had an accident and is much disfigured. I saw him out the window, but I am glad to say that I did not meet him. He had a long talk with Mr. Carruthers, who seemed much excited afterwards. Woodley must be staying in the neighborhood, for he did not sleep here, and yet I caught a glimpse of him again this morning slinking about in the shrubbery. I would sooner have a savage wild animal loose than in that place. I loathe and fear him more than I say. How can Mr. Carruthers endure such a creature for a moment? However, all my troubles will be over on Saturday.
So I trust, Watson, so I trust, said Holmes, gravely. There is some deep intrigue going on around that little woman, and it is our duty to see that no one molests her on her last journey. I think, Watson, that we must spare some time to run down together on Saturday morning, and make sure that this curious, inconclusive investigation has no untoward ending. I confess that I was not up to now taking a very serious view of this case, which had seemed to me rather grotesque and bizarre rather than dangerous. That a man should lie in wait and to follow a very handsome woman is no unheard-of thing, and if he had so little audacity that he not only dared to address her, but even fled from her approach, he was not a very formidable assailant. The ruffian Woodley was a different person, but except on one occasion he had not molested our client. Now he visited the house of Carruthers without intruding upon her presence. The man of the bicycle was dubiously a member of those weekend parties of the guest with which the publican had spoken. But who was he, and what he wanted was obscure as ever. It was the severity of Holmes's manner, and the fact that he slipped a revolver into his pocket before leaving our rooms, which impressed me with a feeling that tragedy again might prove to lurk behind this curious train of events. A rainy night had been followed by the glorious morning, and the heath-covered countryside, with glowing clumps of flowering gorse, seemed all the more beautiful to the eyes of the many of the duns and drabs of the grey slates of London. Holmes and I walked along the broad, sandy road, hailing the fresh morning air and rejoicing in the music of the birds and the fresh breath of the spring. From a rise in the road on the shoulder of the Crooksbury Hill, we could see the grim hall bursting out from amidst the ancient oaks, which, as old as they were still younger than the building which they surrounded. Holmes pointed out the long tract of road which wound a reddish-yellow band between the brown of the heath and the budding green of the woods. Far away, a black dot could be seen, a vehicle moving in our direction. Holmes gave an exclamation of impatience. "I give it a margin of half an hour," said he. "If that is her trap, she must be making for an earlier train. I fear, Watson, that she will pass the Charlington before we have a possibility to meet her." From the instant that we passed the rise, we could no longer see the vehicle, but we hastened onwards at such a pace that my sedentary life began to tell upon me, and I was compelled to fall behind. Holmes, however, was always in training, for he had inexhaustible stores of nervous energy upon which to draw. His springy step never slowed until suddenly, when he was halted 100 yards in front of me, and I saw him throw up his hand in a gesture of grief and despair. At the same instant, an empty dog-cart and horse cantering, the reins trailing, appeared around the curve of the road and rattling swiftly towards us. "Too late, Watson, too late!" cried Holmes as I ran panting to his side. "Fool that I was to not allow for that earlier train. The abduction, Watson, abduction, murder, heaven knows what. Block the road, stop the horse, that's right. Now jump in and let us see if we can repair the consequences of our own blunder." We had sprung inside the dog-cart, and Holmes, after turning the horse, gave it a sharp cut of the whip, and we flew back along the road. As we turned the curve, the whole stretch of road between the hall and the heath was opened up. Holmes gasped. I grasped Holmes' arm. "That's the man," I gasped. A solitary cyclist was coming towards us. His head was down and his shoulders rounded as he put every ounce of energy he had possessed into the pedals. He was flying like a racer. Suddenly he raised his beard, face, and saw us to close him. And pulling up, springing from his machine, the coal-black beard was a singular contrast to the pallor of his face, and his eyes were as bright as he had a fever. He stared at us at the dog-cart, then took an amazement that came over his face. "Hello, stop there!" he shouted, holding his bicycle to block our road. "Wherever did you get that dog-cart? Pull up, man!" he yelled, drawing a pistol from his side pocket. "Pull up, I say, or by George, it'll be a bullet in your horse." Holmes threw the reins into my lap and sprang down from the cart. "You're the man I want to see. Where's Miss Violet Smith?" he said, with a quick, clear way. "That's what I was asking you. You're in the dog-cart. You ought to know where she is." "We met the dog-cart on the road. There was no one in it. We drove back to help the young lady." Good Lord, what shall I do?" cried the stranger in an ecstasy of despair. "They've got her, that hellhound Woodley, and the blackguard Person. Come, man, come. If you really are her friend, stand by me and we'll save her together. If I have to leave my carcass in Charlington Wood." He ran distractedly, his pistol in his hand, towards a gap in the hedge. Holmes followed him, and I, leaving the horse grazing beside the road, followed Holmes. "This is the point they came through," said he, pointing to the marks in several feet upon the muddy path. "Hello, stop a minute. Who's this in the bush?" It was a young fellow about 17, dressed like an ulster, with leather cords and garters. He lay upon his back, his knees drawn up, a terrible cut upon his head. He was insensitive, but alive. A glance at his wound told me that he had not been penetrated to the bone. "That's Peter, the groom," cried the stranger. "He drove her. The beasts have pulled him off and clubbed him. Let him lie. We can't do him any good, but we can save her from the worst fate that can befall a woman." We ran frantically down the path, which wound among the trees. We had reached the shrubbery which surrounded the house when Holmes pulled up. "They didn't go into the house. Here are their marks on the left here. beside the laurel bushes. Ah, I said so. As he spoke, a woman's shrill scream, and a scream which reverberated from the frenzy of horror, burst from the thick green clump of bushes in front of us. It ended suddenly in the high tone of a note, choke, and a gurgle. This way, this way! They're in the bowling alley, cried the stranger, darting through the bushes. Ah, the cowardly dogs! Follow me, gentlemen! Too late, too late! By the living jingo! We had broken suddenly into a lovely glade and greensward surrounded by ancient trees. On the farther side of it, under the shadow of a mighty oak, there stood a singular group of 3 people. One was a woman, reclined drooping and faint, a handkerchief around her mouth. Opposite her stood the brutal, heavy-faced, red-moustached young man, his gaitering legs parted wide, his arms akimbo, the other waving a riding crop, his whole attitude suggestive of triumphant bravado. Between them, an elderly, grey-bearded man, wearing a short surplice over a light tweed suit, had evidently just completed the wedding service, for he pocketed a prayer book and appeared and slapped the sinister bridegroom upon the back in a jovial congratulation. "They're married," I gasped. "Come on," cried our guide. "Come on." He rushed across the glade, Holmes and I at his heels. As we approached, the lady staggered back against the trunk of a tree for support. Williamson, the ex-clergyman, bowed us with mock politeness, and the bully Woodley advanced with a shout and brutal, excellent laughter. "You can take your beard off, Bob," he said. I know you right enough. Well, you and your pals have just come in time to be able to introduce you to Mrs. Woodley." Our guide's answer was a singular one. He snatched off the dark beard which had disguised him and threw it on the ground, and disclosed the long, sallow, clean-shaven face below it. Then he raised his revolver and covered the young ruffian who was advancing upon him with his dangerous riding crop swinging in his hand. "Yes," said our ally, "I am Bob Carruthers, and I'll see the woman righted if I have to swing it for. I told you what I'd do if you molested her, and by the Lord I'll be as good as my word." "You're too late. She's my wife." "No, she's your widow." The revolver cracked, and I saw the blood spurt from the front of Woodley's waistcoat. He spun around with a scream and fell upon his back, his hideous red face turning suddenly to a dreadful mottled pallor. The old man, still clad in his surplice, burst into such a string of foul oaths I have never heard, and pulled out a revolver of his own. But before he could raise it, he was looking down the barrel of Holmes's weapon. "Enough of this," said my friend coldly. "Drop that pistol. Watson, pick it up. Hold it to his head. Thank you. You, Carruthers, give me that revolver. We'll have no more violence. Come, hand it over." "Who are you, then?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes." "Good Lord!" "You have heard of me, I see. I will represent the official police until their arrival. Here, you." He shouted to a frightened groom who had appeared at the edge of the glade. "Come here. Take this note as hard as you can ride to Farning." He scribbled a few notes upon a leaf from his notebook. "Give it to the superintendent at the police station. Until he comes, I must detain you all under my personal custody." The strong, masterful personality of Holmes dominated the tragic scene, and all were equally puppets in his hands. Williamson and Carruthers found themselves carrying the wounded Woodley into the house, and I gave my arm to the frightened girl. The injured man was laid on his bed, and Holmes requested I examine him. I carried my report to where he sat in the old tapestry-hung dining room with his 2 prisoners before him. "He will live," I said. "What?" cried Carruthers, springing out of his chair. "I'll go upstairs and finish him first." "Do you tell that to the girl? The angel is to be tied to the Rodley Jack Woodley for life?" "You need not concern yourself about that," said Holmes. "There are 2 very good reasons why she should under no circumstance be his wife. In the first place, we are very safe in questioning Mr. Williamson's right to solemnise a marriage." "I've been ordained," said the old rascal, "and also unfrocked." "Once a clergyman, always a clergyman." "I think not." How about the license? We had a license for the marriage. I have it here in my pocket. Then you got it by a trick. But in any case, a forged marriage is no marriage. But it is a very serious felony, and you will discover before you have finished. You'll have time to think that point out during the next 10 years or so, unless I'm mistaken. As to you, Carruthers, you would have done better to keep your pistol in your pocket. I begin to think so, Mr. Holmes, but when I thought of all the precaution I had taken to shield this girl, for I loved her, Mr. Holmes, and it is the only time that I ever knew what love was, it fairly drove me mad to think that she was in the power of the greatest brute and bully in South Africa, a man whose name is a holy terror from Kimberley to Johannesburg. Why, Mr. Holmes, you'll hardly believe it, but ever since that girl has been in my employment, I never once let her go past this house where I knew the rascals were lurking without following her on my bicycle, just to see that she came to no harm. I kept my distance from her, and I wore a beard so that she would not recognize me, for she is a good and high-spirited girl, and she wouldn't have stayed in my employment long if she had thought that I was following her about on country roads. Why didn't you tell her of her danger? Because then, again, she would have left me, and I couldn't bear that fact. Even if she couldn't love me, it was no great deal to me just to have her dainty form about the house and to hear the sound of her voice. Well, said I, you call that love, Mr. Carruthers. I should call it selfishness. Maybe the two things go together. Anyhow, I couldn't let her go. Besides, with this crowd about, it was well that she should have someone near to look after her. And then when the cable came, and I knew that they were bound to make a move. What cable? Carruthers took a telegram from his pocket. That's it, said he. It was short and concise. The old man is dead. Said Holmes. I think I see how things worked, and I can understand how this message would, as you say, bring them to a head. But while we can wait, you might tell me what you can. The old reprobate was in surprise burst into a volley of bad language. By heavens, he said, if you squeal on me as Bob Carruthers, I'll serve you as you served Jack Woodley. You can bleat about the girl with your heart's content. That's your own affair. But if you round on your pals in this plainclothes copper, it will be the worst day that you ever did. Your reverence need not be excited, said Holmes, lighting a cigarette. The case is clear enough against you, and all I ask is a few details for my private curiosity. However, if there's any difficulty in your telling me, I'll do the talking, and then you will see how far you have the chance of holding back your secrets. In the first place, 3 of you came from South Africa on this game. You, Williamson, and you, Carruthers, and Woodley. Lie number 1, said the old man. I neither saw either of them until 2 months ago, and I've never been to Africa in my life, so you can put that in your pipe and smoke it, Mr. Busybody Holmes. What he says is true, said Carruthers. Well. 2 of you came over. His reverence is his own made article. You had known Ralph Smith in South Africa. You had reason to believe he would not live long. You found out that his niece would inherit his fortune. That's so, eh? Carruthers nodded, and Williamson swore. She was next of kin, no doubt, and you were aware that the old fellow would make no will. Couldn't read nor write, said Carruthers. So you came over, the 2 of you, and hunted up the girl. The idea was that one of you was to marry her and the other have a share of the plunder. For some reason, Woodley was chosen as the husband. Why was that? We played cards for her on the voyage. He won. I see. You got the young lady into your service, and then Woodley was to do the courting. She recognized the drunken brute that he was, and would have nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, your arrangement was rather upset by the fact that you had yourself fallen in love with the lady. You could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian owning her. No, by George, I couldn't. There was a quarrel between you. He left you in a rage and began to make his own plans independently of you. Strikes me, Williamson, there isn't very much that we can tell this gentleman, cried Carruthers, with a rather bitter laugh. Yes, we quarreled, and he knocked me down, and I'm level with him on that. Then I lost sight of him. That was when I picked up the Cas Padre here. I found that he had set up housekeeping together in this place and on the line that she was to pass the station. I kept my eye on her after that, for I knew there was some devilry in the wind. I saw them from time to time, for I was anxious to know what they were after. 2 days ago, Woodley came up to my house with his cable, which showed me that Ralph was dead. He asked me if I would stand by the bargain. I said I would not. He asked me if I would marry the girl myself and give him a share. I said I would willingly do so, but that she would not have me. He said, let us get her married first, and after a week or two she may see things a bit differently. I said I would have nothing to do with violence, so he went off cursing, like the foul-mouthed blackguard that he was, and swearing that he would have her yet. She was leaving me this weekend, and I had got a trap to take her to the station, but I was so uneasy in my mind that I followed her on my bicycle. She had got a start, however, and before I could catch her, the mischief was done. First thing I knew, it was about when I saw you two gentlemen driving back in her dog cart. Holmes rose and tossed the end of his cigarette into the grate. I've been very obtuse, Watson, he said. One in your report you said that you had seen the cyclist, as you thought, arrange the necktie for his shrubbery. That alone would have told me all. However, we may congratulate ourselves upon a curious, unique case. I perceive there are 3 of the county constabulary in the drive, and I'm glad to see that the little ostler is able to keep pace with him. So it is likely that neither he nor the interesting bridegroom will be permanently damaged by this morning's adventures. I think, Watson, that in your medical capacity you might wait upon Miss Smith and tell her that she is sufficiently recovered. We shall be happy to escort her to her mother's home. If she is not quite convalescent, you will find that the hints that we were about to telegraph to a young electrician in the Midlands would probably complete the cure. As to you, Mr. Carruthers, I think that you have done what you could to make amends for your share in this evil plot. There is my card, sir, and if you have any evidence to help you with your trial, it shall be at your disposal. In the whirl of our incessant activity, it was often been difficult for me, as the reader has probably observed, to round off my narratives and give those final details which the curious might expect. Each case has been a prelude to another, and the crisis over one of the actors has passed for ever out of the busy lives. I find, however, a short note at the end of my manuscripts dealing with this case, in which I have put upon record that Miss Violet Smith did indeed inherit a large fortune, and that she is now the wife of Cyril Morton, the senior partner of Morton and Kennedy, the famous Westminster electricians. Williamson and Woodley were both tried for abduction and assault, after getting 7 years and later 10. Of the fate of Carruthers I have no record, but I am sure that his assault was not viewed very gravely by the court, since Woodley had the reputation of being a most dangerous ruffian, and I think that a few months were sufficient to satisfy the demands of justice. Whew. All right, then. I did see you come in, Oni. Thank you for the stretch and hydrate. I did actually do those. I just, didn't say anything. I needed to hydrate after that. Oh. So, 2 more stories. That leaves 9 in this book. And then there's only one book left of the Arthur Conan Doyle stories. Kind of cool, huh? I have, however, gotten a suggestion from Matsu that there's the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. There's 2 books of them. So I may see about reading those too, since it does say that some of them were written by Conan Doyle too. So I got ear squishes twice. Cool. Oh. Let's see. Who to read, who to read, who to read, who to read. If anyone has any suggestions, by all means, pop them up. Let's see, who's on? My browsers are severely lagging, so I can't really see who's on. They're still on. Wait. Are they on? There's someone that I just started following today. If my browsers would tell if they're on or not. Ugh. Why is my computer so freaking laggy? So, any suggestions? That said, I'm pretty open. So I'm definitely more open than my computer is, apparently, but, you know. See, what are people doing right now? I don't see. Oh, I see Falco around. I haven't rated her for a while. I think she was reading Peter Pan last time I checked, but we're open right now. Let's see what she's doing. She just says ASMR, but she reads. So, there are lots of people in this follow us that I just don't really recognize the names of. I'm not sure why. Man, how many people are streaming right now? Okay, looks like you are still on, Noni. Our computer's just being really laggy. What is this one? Oh. Come on, computer. What is your deal? By the way, Oni, your title says Super Animal Royale. If you're hearing me. What? How did I jump out of my own window? Okay. So, any ideas? Or do I want to raid someone I haven't raided before? I'll raid someone I haven't raided before. Okay, so we're going to raid someone that was hanging out in Nixie's stream earlier. Who's PNG's tuber. They're also affiliates, so probably wouldn't hurt to give them a raid anyway. So I've got my follower raid message and my sub raid message. If Kel will be so polite to put those up. Okay, she put them up. Good. But we are going to raid Lamia. Just because I want to trade someone new. And as I said, I just started following them today, so I want to see what they're up to. So, thank you everyone for coming by. I hope you all enjoyed the stories. I will be back tomorrow night for Friday Night Fairy Tales. Because I like fairy tales. For good reason. They're good stories. So, I bid you all good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, whichever time zone you may currently exist in. And I will see you next time. Take it easy, Squall. Take it easy, taking it easy. Don't let the sound of your own